Warning: this episode contains strong opinions, uncomfortable truths, and analysis that challenges media narratives, political rebrands, and partisan spin from both sides of the aisle. We don't deal in slogans here, we deal in consequences. Listener discretion advised.
They didn't change their policies, they changed their words. For years, the argument over the border wasn't about enforcement, it was about abolition. Then that language got buried, rebranded, and politely shelved while the cameras moved on. But now, with a new administration, renewed enforcement, and polling that won't cooperate, the old arguments are back, just dressed up in softer clothes. Suddenly, the same voices that once treated federal immigration enforcement like a moral crime are talking about professional standards, accountability, and law and order, not because the system changed, but because the optics did. And while they say they support enforcement, the fine print tells a different story. New restrictions, new hurdles, new rules that make enforcement harder while claiming it's being made safer. This isn't a policy evolution, it's a messaging war. Tonight, we're breaking down the contradiction between rhetoric and reality, between saying you support enforcement and pushing policies that weaken it, between defending agents publicly while undermining them legislatively. This isn't about left versus right, it's about whether words still mean anything when the pressure hits. Because when the language shifts but the outcomes don't, that's not reform. That's narrative control. This is data and dissonance, and tonight we're talking about the immigration messaging war. Tonight we're bringing in the full panel, because this conversation isn't about slogans, it's about what actually happens when the cameras turn off. Brian is here, bringing the MAGA fire, cutting straight through political double talk, and calling out the difference between sounding tough and actually enforcing the law. Rachel joins us with an independent lens, separating reform from sabotage, pressure from principle, and reminding everyone that accountability without enforcement is just performance. Daniel's on the board tonight, pulling at the threads behind the language shifts, asking who benefits when rhetoric softens but systems don't change, and why certain words disappear right when they're most inconvenient. And Skylar is here to challenge us from the left, not with talking points, but with pushback rooted in civil liberties, proportional enforcement, and the real human costs that get lost when immigration becomes nothing but a political weapon. 4 perspectives, 1 issue, no narrative shields, and let's get into it. For the last year, immigration hasn't just been a policy fight, it's been a full-scale messaging war. What we're watching right now isn't a sudden discovery of law and order, it's a rebrand. Language that once treated federal immigration enforcement as illegitimate is now being recycled into phrases like accountability, professional standards, and oversight, all while new rules are being proposed that make enforcement slower, riskier, and harder to carry out. The contradiction is hard to ignore. Public statements of support paired with legislative and administrative pressure that limits how agents operate in the field. Support in the press conferences, restraints in the fine print, and when the polling shifts, so does the tone, not necessarily the outcomes. So the question isn't whether enforcement should be humane. That's a given. The real question is whether you can claim to support enforcement while systematically boxing it in. Brian, let me start with you. Brian, conservatives argue that what we're seeing right now isn't genuine reform. It's political camouflage. Democrats say they support enforcement, but then push restrictions that make it harder to enforce the law, especially under pressure from activist groups and progressive voters. From your perspective, is this an honest shift in philosophy? Or is it simply rebranding old opposition to immigration enforcement now that the optics have turned against them?
Look, this isn't complicated, and that's what makes it so frustrating. What we're watching isn't some moral awakening or philosophical shift, it's panic. For years, the activist wing of the left treated immigration enforcement like it was inherently evil. They didn't just want better standards, they questioned whether the law should even be enforced in the first place. That language got quieter when they were in charge, but the mindset never changed. Now the border's a mess, cities are overwhelmed, crime and fentanyl numbers won't lie, and suddenly they're pretending they've always been about law and order. Come on, here's the tell. If you actually support enforcement, you don't stack it with conditions that make it impossible to do the job. You don't add layers of warrants for routine operations, restrict protective measures for agents, or design rules that look good in a press release but get people hurt in the field. That's not reform. That's sabotage with better branding. It lets politicians say, we support ICE, while quietly satisfying the same activists who never wanted ICE to exist in the first place. And the timing matters. This didn't happen in a vacuum. Polling shifted. Voters got fed up. Blue city mayors started begging for help. Suddenly, the rhetoric softened, but the policies stayed restrictive. Conservatives aren't fooled by that, and honestly, I don't think most regular voters are either. You can't claim to support enforcement while treating enforcement like a liability. At some point, people notice the difference between sounding tough and actually backing the people enforcing the law.
Yeah, and that's the part that keeps jumping out at me. Because if this were really about reform, we'd be seeing changes that make enforcement clearer, safer, and more effective, not slower and more politically fragile. What Brian's pointing to is the gap between what gets said on camera and what gets written into policy. Supporting enforcement in theory while treating it like a public relations liability in practice doesn't square, and voters can feel that disconnect even if they can't quote the fine print. And I think the timing matters more than people want to admit. This shift didn't come from a breakthrough in values. It came from pressure. Pressure from polls, pressure from cities buckling under the strain, pressure from voters who are tired of chaos being explained away. When the message changes but the structure doesn't, that's not progress. That's repositioning. Rachel, let me bring you in here. Democrats argue that these proposed restrictions aren't about undermining enforcement, but about professionalism, accountability, and protecting civil liberties, especially in tense environments. From your independent perspective, where is the legitimate line between necessary oversight and policies that unintentionally weaken enforcement? And do you think Democrats have done enough to clearly separate reform from political rebranding?
I think Brian's right about one thing that's uncomfortable for a lot of people to admit. Timing matters and optics matter, whether we like it or not. When public pressure rises, language changes, and that's true across the political spectrum. But where I'd slow this down is in separating intent from execution. There is a legitimate argument for oversight in any law enforcement context, especially when operations happen in volatile, emotionally charged environments. Accountability isn't inherently anti-enforcement. In theory, it can protect both agents and civilians when it's done right. That said, where Democrats lose credibility is in how these proposals land in the real world. When reforms pile up without a clear operational plan, they don't feel like guardrails. They feel like obstacles. If you're an agent on the ground, the difference between oversight and hesitation can be a split second, and lawmakers don't always account for that. The lack of clarity creates fear on both sides. Agents worried about legal exposure, communities worried about uneven enforcement. That's not reform, that's uncertainty. And this is where the messaging problem becomes unavoidable. If Democrats want to be taken seriously when they say they support enforcement, they have to be honest about trade-offs. You can't say we back the mission while quietly designing systems that make the mission harder to carry out. Voters may not follow every bill, but they can sense when language is being used to soften consequences rather than solve problems. Real reform would be transparent about what enforcement gains and what it loses. And right now, that transparency is missing.
That's a fair distinction. And I think that's where this conversation actually gets honest. Oversight and accountability aren't dirty words, and pretending they are doesn't help anyone. But Rachel's point about execution is the pressure point. When lawmakers talk about reform without grappling with how enforcement actually works on the ground, you end up with policies that sound reasonable in a committee room and feel paralyzing in the field. And this is where the trust gap shows up. Because if you genuinely believe in enforcement, you don't design systems that make agents second-guess every move while activists keep pushing the boundaries. Reform that creates hesitation instead of clarity doesn't protect civil liberties. It just creates chaos with better branding. At some point, voters stop listening to the words and start judging the outcomes. Daniel, let me bring you in, because this feels like more than policy. You spend a lot of time looking at how language shifts under pressure. What do you see behind this sudden change in tone, from questioning enforcement to defending it rhetorically while limiting it structurally? Who benefits when the language softens but the system stays constrained? And do you think this ambiguity is accidental or intentional?
This is absolutely intentional, and that's the part people keep missing. Language doesn't just shift in politics, it gets engineered. When you see a coordinated move away from phrases like abolish and toward words like oversight and professional standards, that's not growth, that's calibration. It's about keeping the coalition together while avoiding accountability for outcomes. You soften the language so moderates don't panic, but you keep the structural restraints so activists stay satisfied. Everyone gets something, except effective enforcement. Who benefits? Politicians, first and foremost. Ambiguity is political oxygen. If enforcement fails, they can blame agents for not following new rules closely enough. If enforcement succeeds, they take credit for responsible reform. Heads they win, tails the system loses, and the public is left arguing about tone while the mechanics quietly break down. That's not accidental. That's how you avoid owning the consequences. And zoom out for a second. This isn't unique to immigration. We've seen the same playbook with policing, energy, even speech. You don't eliminate a system outright. You regulate it into paralysis while insisting you support it. It creates plausible deniability. When chaos follows, you say, "Well, we tried to balance things." No, you tried to manage optics. And the longer people argue over words instead of results, the longer that strategy works.
That's the dangerous part of ambiguity. It lets everyone claim moral high ground while nobody owns the outcomes. Daniel's right about one thing that's uncomfortable. When language gets softer but systems get tighter, it creates cover for politicians, cover for bureaucrats, and confusion for the public. And when confusion becomes the norm, accountability disappears. People aren't debating results anymore. They're debating intentions, and that's how you end up stuck in permanent limbo. Enforcement is never abolished, so critics can't claim victory, but it's never fully supported either, so the system keeps failing just enough to justify the next round of reform. That cycle doesn't help agents, communities, or migrants. It just sustains the argument. Skylar, let me bring you in. Critics on the right argue that these reforms and restrictions, intentional or not, weaken enforcement and worsen border chaos. Supporters on the left say the real issue is protecting civil liberties, preventing abuses, and stopping enforcement from becoming excessive or dehumanizing. From your perspective, where do conservatives get this wrong? And how do you balance human dignity and accountability without letting enforcement collapse into either cruelty or chaos?
I think conservatives are right to call out mixed messaging, but where I push back is on the assumption that the only alternative to chaos is maximal enforcement. For a lot of people on the left, the concern isn't about whether the law exists, it's about how power gets exercised when systems are under strain. Immigration enforcement happens at the intersection of fear, poverty, and desperation, and when oversight is weak, the consequences aren't abstract. They land on families, on communities, and sometimes on people who aren't even the intended targets of enforcement actions. That doesn't mean enforcement shouldn't happen. It means it shouldn't operate on autopilot. When agents are put in impossible situations without clear rules, the risk isn't just abuse, it's erosion of legitimacy. And once legitimacy collapses, compliance collapses with it. Oversight, when done right, isn't about tying hands. It's about setting boundaries that keep enforcement credible in the eyes of the public. Conservatives often underestimate how much trust matters in making any system function long-term. Where Democrats struggle, and I'll agree with that critique, is failing to be honest about trade-offs. You can't demand accountability without acknowledging that some enforcement capacity will slow, and you can't promise humanitarian outcomes without addressing border volume and infrastructure. If this debate keeps pretending there's a cost-free solution, we're going to keep cycling between crackdowns and collapses. Real reform would accept that dignity, enforcement, and stability all require limits, and that nobody gets everything they want.
This is why the argument keeps going in circles, because everyone's talking past the trade-offs. Conservatives are right to call out rebranding and political cover. Progressives are right to warn about unchecked power and erosion of trust. But what's missing in this entire debate is ownership. Ownership of consequences. Ownership of outcomes. Ownership of the fact that you can't build a system on ambiguity and expect stability. If enforcement is necessary, and it is, then it has to be supported clearly, not conditionally. If accountability is necessary, and it is, then it has to be operational, not performative. What doesn't work is pretending you can satisfy every faction with softer language while the structure quietly fails underneath. That's not reform. That's deferral. And here's the part voters are picking up on, whether politicians like it or not. When words keep changing but results don't, credibility erodes. People stop trusting institutions, stop trusting leadership, and stop believing that anyone is actually steering the system until lawmakers are willing to be honest about limits of compassion, limits of enforcement, limits of resources. This debate isn't going to end. It's just going to keep getting louder. That's the dissonance. And that's why this issue isn't going away.
Before we wrap this up, quick pause, because if you support having honest conversations without narrative filters, one of the easiest ways to help keep this show independent is through the merch. We've got Data and Dissonance gear in the store right now. Shirts, hoodies, hats, mugs, stuff you can actually wear or use without looking like a walking bumper sticker. Clean designs, solid quality, and yeah, a few that make the point without asking permission. Every purchase helps keep the lights on, keeps the show uncensored, and helps us keep doing exactly what we did tonight, breaking down the fine print instead of just reacting to the headlines. Links in the description. Check it out when you get a minute.
What tonight really exposed isn't a left-right divide, it's a credibility divide. When leaders spend more time managing language than managing outcomes, people feel it. You can hear it in the frustration, you can see it in the polling, and you can feel it in communities that are dealing with the consequences of decisions made far away from the realities on the ground. Immigration isn't abstract, it's not theoretical. It's lived by agents, by local governments, by migrants themselves. And when the system is guided by optics instead of honesty, everyone pays for it. The hard truth is this: there is no solution that doesn't involve trade-offs. Compassion without enforcement collapses. Enforcement without accountability loses legitimacy. And pretending otherwise is how we got stuck in this loop to begin with. What voters are asking for, whether politicians want to hear it or not, is clarity. Clear rules, clear priorities, clear ownership of consequences, not rebrands, not press conference language, not talking points that evaporate the moment reality pushes back. And that's why conversations like this matter. Because if we don't challenge narrative drift, if we don't question why words change faster than results, then nothing improves. It just cycles. At Data and Dissonance, the goal isn't to hand you answers wrapped in certainty. It's to give you the framework to think clearly when the noise gets loud. Remember to speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode is brought to you by the Caleb Rourke Thriller Series, a political military thriller universe that doesn't flinch from the realities of power, corruption, and the cost of truth. Start with the Covenant Protocol, where shadow governments and covert alliances set the stage. Continue with the Prophet Directive, where ideology becomes weaponized and the line between faith and control starts to blur. And if you want the latest, Black Echo Rising is out now, raising the stakes with global consequences and enemies hiding in plain sight. If you like your thrillers grounded, intelligent, and uncomfortably close to reality, you'll feel right at home. Available now on Amazon. Links are in the description.